This next segment is something peculiar that exists in NGS. Phantasy Star has always been about instancing areas, and so what I'm going to do here is quite simple. If you read on the top left, it says I'm in a photo room. You can enter in a photo room and then set it in your options that you have the quest counter available. So if you feel that being in a city is limiting your hardware, but you need to be in a city anyhow, you can always enter a photo room in the city itself. And so I want to see the difference of performance, a difference in performance in the city itself with no one, in the four cities with no one running around, as opposed to having people. And I'm going to do both. I'm going to go around the four cities. I'm going to run around up and down, take you along for the ride. And I will end each area in my favorite spot. So I'll start with a photo room for four cities. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to uncap my FPS. For this test, I'm going to set it to native, and I'm going to set it to unrestricted frame rate. So this is important because you don't need 60 frames per second in a city. You can run with 30, especially if you are standing still most of the time. If you want to save on power and you are on PC and you're going AFK, hit the Windows key. It will drop your frame rate to 30 and you'll give your system a break as well. Instead of your system throwing in the maximum frame rate, it will drop down to 30. So your system is taking a break just like you're taking a break. It will bring down those GPU temps and CPU temps for a while. So let's start. So I'm going to go up and I'm going to go around. Like so far, this video card is pretty good. I say it in every segment. This is not a 4K card, but I'm running at 4K native. Okay. That's not so bad. Now, I know that you probably are looking at the top right and you're noticing these temperatures. That is actually the normal operating temperature of the ARX cards, and it can actually be controlled. So it doesn't really faze me so much because I am still getting the performance of the card itself. So next is Retem. Now, an interesting tidbit to Retem. If you deal with the concert in Retem, it will lower your FPS to 60. It will lock it to 60. It's actually an interesting thing. If you are in the other cities, it won't lock your FPS. Now, what is interesting is that even though there's a slowdown in the frame rate, you find yourself, or I find myself, that it is still smooth for the slowdown. It's not like there are animations that require 60 frame rate, 60 frames per second to the point that you'll see massive stuttering. This is still smooth to the ratio of the frame rate that I'm seeing because this game is optimized for consoles as well. So the developers made sure this game was created in a way that it is made for 30 frames per second, which is really, really neat when it comes to animations. Now, if you want to see an example of where stuttering occurs, there is a video game called Unreal Tournament 2004. That game has a minigun, and I guarantee you that when you're running at 60 frames per second and someone fires that weapon at you, you start seeing stuttering issues and things like that early on, because that game's engine for that game actually was more optimized for 75 and 85 frames per second as opposed to 60. So that was a game where 60 FPS wasn't enough. You needed to actually lock at 90 FPS to not deal with the stuttering of weapons, which is an interesting bit, because we're taught to think, 60 FPS, 30 versus 60, and then going from 60 to 120, 90 if you're doing VR gaming. So you start wondering, where did we get these refresh rates of 75 hertz or 85 hertz? Like, where did they all come from? And it's because of different engines and different technologies that actually required people to have that high of a frame rate. So that creates another rule. If you have 120 hertz refresh rate, you need to have a card that can push 120 frames per second. So if your video card cannot push 120 frames per second or 240 frames per second when this game caps at 180, don't bother going for those high refresh rate monitors to begin with if you can't pull the frames to match the refresh rate. So going to Kavaris. So once again, if you are running a 120 hertz refresh rate monitor, you need 120 frames per second. This is one of the reasons why 4090s end up selling. This is a reason why high-end AMD cards and high-end NVIDIA cards sell, because you need the frame rate to match the refresh rate, to be 1-to-1 and be buttery smooth. So I walk around and I go into the oasis. I just called it an oasis. In the middle of an ice area. I guess I still have Ritem's desert fever. No, I meant the hot springs. Alright, so I'm gonna now see, this is the area where the textures are everywhere, and so it really has to fill the screen, and so the frame rate is dropping. Also, from 5.4 gigabytes of VRAM being used up here. So this is interesting. Okay. So I'm gonna go now to Stia. So it's allocating to memory. Like I'm looking at the top right. Adding to the VRAM. Okay. So this is not bad to be able to run at 4K native. I think as an added bonus, I will run through my own creative space. So let me go to... Let me go through Celestia. That's what I will use to bridge the two. So here, in some areas, I'm over 60 frames per second. Because there's a lot of sky, and there's a lot of, sure, models placed down, but they're not like a bunch of rock textures left and right. And when I put this together, because I've spent some time doing level design for Unreal Engine games as a modder and a mapper, like I know what causes players to take frame rate hits. Because if you're designing a map for a game, you have to think about the average hardware that is out there versus what the average gamer in your game may have. So if you make a map where the requirement is that everyone needs to have the highest end hardware, it becomes more like a hardware benchmark map, where if you can push 60 FPS in that map, then you can run any map that the game has to offer. Alright, so that's not bad. Notice that the RAM dropped to less than 12 gigabytes, and memory is at 4.4, like video RAM is at 4.4 gigabytes out of 8. So I did pretty good in making this map. Alright, so now I will go back. So return to ArcSpace. So I go back to Central City, but before I do that, I want to get out of the photo room. So it literally is going to be time to say, do your worst. So this will be the lowest frame rate that I will see. And so I will end the photo room. So let's see what happens when I go through Central City. In order for this to be fair, I want it to actually be in the most populated block for Central City, which would be 8005. So I want to say, okay. So now comes a lesson in humility on how video cards work. Do you see all these characters that are in the lobby? All of them guess what? It's processing them as high-end textures. So I have reached my video card limit. That's right, you are seeing 8.8 gigs of VRAM. Now, this card only has 8. So where are the other 600 being taken from? Well, guess what? There is a paging file in the system, and it will use your system RAM as well as your paging file to throw in that data. So I am using more memory than the card itself has. But since I have RAM that is at 2 gigahertz, or 4000 megahertz, but it's 2000 times 2 in DDR4, that helps a lot, and the memory bandwidth of the RAM helps. So when you run out of video RAM, having the highest speed, lowest latency RAM as far as compromise becomes important in your system. So all those review sites that tell you that the speed of the RAM does not really matter, or it does if you buy a budget card and you run out of memory. But notice, 8.7 gigabytes of VRAM, even though I only have 8. So those 700 megabytes are coming from somewhere. 9.4, 9.5, and I'm over 16 gigs of physical RAM. Now, I was gonna run around Ritem, Kavaris, and Stia, but this map shows an example of what I was aiming to show you. Like, this is what I was aiming to show you. See, I went from... If I go over here, watch this. I'm staring at this. I am down to 7 gigs of RAM. And let's see, it should drop a bit, right? Oh, it did to 6.7. 6.7, because this is stuff that's loaded into the video RAM. So let's say that you have a system and you only have 16 gigabytes of RAM, and you have a video card that has 8 gigs of RAM, and you decide to max out all the settings and you play 4K. This is what's going to happen. First, you won't have enough system RAM, and you won't have enough VRAM. So it will make a place in your solid state drive that is your paging file. And while it's accessing from that, your frame rate will drop like a rock. So I'm 9.9. 10. I broke 10 gigs. 10 gigs from loading textures of different characters. Now, let me show you something. If I go and make the photo room again, what happens if I make the photo room? They all disappear, and guess what? It's down to 5 gigs of RAM. So, the lesson or moral of this story, of this section, is that you will use the most amount of video memory and physical memory in the most populated block. You will also have the highest temperature because it is processing all of those textures that are in all those character models. Now, what you can do is go to options, go to graphics, and disable high resolution display of other players. But be careful. Be careful with this, because if you're planning on taking screenshots of your friends, what will happen is that when you and your friend are together taking a screenshot, your textures will be high quality, but the textures of your friends won't be. So be careful. Now, if I disable that and I go into if I get out of the photo room, will it go to 10 gigabytes of RAM again? Let's see how far this counter goes now that I disabled that. See? Notice that it's under 8 gigabytes of RAM. Notice that once I disabled that option, I was within my limits of video memory, my limits on system RAM. I have 32 gigabytes of system RAM, but suppose you are a person who only has 16 gigs of RAM, and you can't afford to basically use up all your memory on both ends. That option is the difference. So all these players do not have high quality textures, even though they look okay. I can kind of tell. And guess what? Your video RAM can tell too, because you just saw it break. You just saw it break 10 gigs of VRAM, even though there are only 8 gigs on this card, which meant it used 2 gigs of system RAM. You know what? I'm going to entertain you guys again. I know I did it before, but I'm going to entertain you guys again. So I'm here, and I'm going to just go to Options, Graphics, and I'm actually going to enable high resolution. And guess what? There it is, climbing up again. I'm standing still, and I've already used all of my VRAM. So now I am at 9 gigs. And the best part is that lighting effects usually end up consuming more RAM. So yes, there is a difference between high resolution textures. I'm at went to 9.7. So here's the funny thing, when it takes up the whole screen, most of the screen, yeah, 9.3. So what happens if I decide to get close to it? So now I'll go back to the setting again. And I'll disable it. And notice that changes all the characters immediately. And there you go. So if you want to crush your system, like if you want to truly be the worst you can be to your system, you will be like certain players who like to go AFK in the most populated block with all settings at maximum, completely bringing up the system demand to an almighty high. You just saw how easily I got up to 9 gigs of RAM. Like 9 gigs of VRAM when I only have 8. So there you go. So that concludes this segment. I don't have to run through the other 3 cities because I've made my point clear.